Hi, welcome back to another episode of Tim's Garage and the continuing improvements that I'm making to my little Saturn Sky Redline. So, under my last video, I had gone through and was doing some tuning and getting the car out and doing some pulls, and I had some help from an individual named Jason Howe, and he had suggested that with all these pulls, my transmission, after I did a few of the quarter-mile standing start pulls, the transmission would start acting funny, like it was super hot. So Jason suggested that I go and add that parameter to the HP Tuner's data log and measure transmission temperature. And sure enough, as I was working the car hard, and it runs really good, I was managing a 13.1 with a little draggy device, a 13.3 with a little draggy device with a 5.10 to 60. And 107 to 109 mile an hour in the quarter mile as ending trap speed. So that's pretty good for a little, basically, stock little car with a little bit of a boost on the turbo and a little bit of extra pressure. So as I was doing that, though, the transmission temperature started to skyrocket to the point of them getting to 260, 270 degrees, which is terminal for an automatic transmission. So rather than continuing to just try and nurse the car, I don't do anything like that. I wanted to make sure I fixed it. So what I decided to do was put in a heavy-duty transmission cooler. Now, putting that transmission cooler in meant that there was some significant roadblocks to that. One, the factory transmission cooler is mounted inside the radiator, and I upgraded my radiator to a Howe radiator that has a upgraded, at least I thought it was an upgraded, transmission cooler inside the radiator for an automatic transmission. And maybe for a normal automatic, it would be fine. But when we start adding the shift pressures and having the car shift as hard as it does 1-2 and 2-3 for the shifts to handle the horsepower, all of a sudden that trans was just getting too hot and it was overpowering the trans cooler that was in the radiator. So I'm adding an additional cooler to that one. That way I can help the transmission get up to temperature quickly by having the coolant having the coolant warm the transmission fluid. And then I've decided to put in a thermostat that'll help regulate temperature to 185 degrees. And as the transmission gets over 185 degrees, it'll now pass that coolant off into the transmission cooler. And so when I went to put that transmission cooler on, I had to do something with the factory power steering cooler. The factory power steering cooler was just a big loop of 3/8 tubing. And it really was not a very effective cooler whatsoever, but it was in the way of adding this 2.5-inch thick, 2-inch thick, 25-row transmission cooler that would have enough capacity to be able to, completely cool the transmission. So what I did is I made room by modifying the power steering cooler lines by removing a small portion of the line. And that portion is I removed this end of it. And those of you that have your own vehicles, you'll recognize this as a piece. And I just cut it off and I removed this from the end of the factory power steering cooler line. And then I practiced a 37-degree flare on it just to make sure that this line would accept a flare and not split. And the GM line accepted a 37-degree flare just fine, so I was good with that. But this is the piece I removed. I then reoriented the power steering lines, and I bent them in kind of a zigzag up, a parallel zigzag up to the cooler, and I'll show an image of that. And with that image showing the lines, I wound up having to mount the cooler slightly down from the top of the radiator so the shield that directs air over the radiator would actually clear it. And I've got clearance all the way around the power steering cooler now. So it fits very well underneath the shield. Once I was able to locate the power steering cooler up to a new location, now I was able to mount the large transmission cooler down to the bottom of the AC condenser. And I'll show an image of how I have that oriented. And that cooler looks like it's going to have enough airflow and capacity to be able to cool really well. Okay, so now that I had the cooler mounted to the AC condenser properly, so that's a Durali 10,000 series cooler, and it's I think 25 plates, and it's 13 inches wide by 8.5 inches tall, so it's a pretty sizable cooler. But once everything was mounted, now I had to figure out, okay, how am I going to get everything to tie into the factory system without using cheesy hose clamps and sliding tubing on and then putting dual hose clamps on it so it doesn't leak. I was a kid once. I did that with my race car and they always leaked. And frankly, that's just not how I'm going to do things now. So now it's all going to be put together with AN fittings and braided hose. And I'll show an example of all that in a minute. But for now, what I wound up having to do is I started to build the lines to be able to move things in. And I had mentioned, or I should mention, that there's a special fitting that's right here that goes in the top of the radiator that comes out from the radiator. And that special fitting, replaces the factory fitting. And the factory fitting looks like this. You may recognize this. So this is a line that's designed to just have your transmission cooler line just press in and it just clips in. And then it threads in. So I wound up with an AN fitting with this thread on one side with an O-ring. And I've threaded that into the chamfered hole that's in the top of the radiator and tightened it in, and now it's got a 6AN fitting coming out. And what I did is I made this hose that runs from the 6AN fitting that's at the radiator, and it's a nylon braided hose that runs all the way up into another 90-degree 6AN fitting here, and this goes into the transmission cooler thermostat, which is set for 185 degrees. I also did the return line from that with another 90-degree, a very short hose here, and then a special adapter that I purchased that is a 6AN adapter with a national pipe thread female end on it, and then I bought a special 1/2-inch pipe thread hose end that takes the 3/8 push-in GM connection that's right there. And you can see I put the plastic little ring back on to secure that fitting so that it can't come loose. So that's how I've managed to get the lines done now. And now I just need to route the lines that are going to go to the front of the vehicle and over to the transmission cooler. So that's sort of the next step. Okay, so I've got the lines built for the back side of it. And one of the things that's important to note is with braided line, you can't necessarily pull that line super tight between 2 points. You have to give it a little bit of a curve so that you've got a little bit of room for it to flex and move. One of the lines is rubber mounted, so it's not a problem, but the fixed point from the radiator to the fixed point that is the thermostat, it's a bit of an arc, and that arc needs to be there. And I'll put an image of that arc to show kind of what I mean by that here. Okay. Now I'm going to run the lines from the front of the thermostat down to the front oil cooler in the front of the car. And where I mounted this is I've been able to locate these two fittings, this fitting here and this fitting here, they're both 90s, to a nylon braided hose, and you can see this hose is located here. I put a piece of rubber hose right here around this edge to create a chafe guard for these hoses, and then I ran the line down, both of them running side by side, uniform down. They run down, they run under the frame rail. They come out the other side of the frame rail over here. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. They come out of the frame rail right over here. They come around, and I made a special little angled clamp. And I've got the hoses clamped right here. It's all loose right now because I'm just fitting it. But that's how the hoses are going to be secured in front of the radiator. And then if you can see the top, then this hose is going to come around, and it is going to be tied into this 90 AN fitting right here. And the other hose will bend the opposite way and move around over to the other 90 fitting that's right here. And both of these hoses will be tucked in behind the intercooler, and they'll be located very well. I just need to measure precisely for length. So that's how the hoses are going to be routed. and it looks to me like it's going to be a very good way to be able to do it. But in order to do all of this hose, you need some special tools. And you know, it's ironic that people that do some of this braided line, they tend to cut a lot of shortcuts, and they cut it with a hacksaw, or they cut it with a die grinder, and they try and put things together without the proper tools, and you wind up with fittings that don't look very good when they're all done. So some minor things. I wound up buying fittings, these 90 fittings and these 45 fittings, from a company called Evil Energy. I bought them off of Amazon. They seem to be pretty good quality. I'm hopeful that they are, because if they aren't, it's going to be a lot of work to be able to replace them. I also bought a couple of billet hose retainers for 6AN hose, and I bought a special wrench that allows me to be able to hang on to the fittings for assembling them, as well as tightening them in the car without damaging the fitting. And then in order to clamp the hose, I've got a special block that's magnetized that mounts to a vise, and it allows you to clamp the fittings. And I've used it now on 8 of the fittings, and it's absolutely a wonderful little tool to be able to do this. And I wish I'd have done this when I was a kid, instead of trying to use just a vise to be able to clamp it. So those are all the special equipment that you need. Now I wanted to show one other thing. So there's 2 kinds of braided line that you can buy these days. We've got nylon coated braided line, and we've got stainless steel covered braided line. So the difference between the 2 lines is this has the stainless outer core, and this has a nylon outer core. Now for race cars, you want a super durable hose that's nothing's going to happen to it, and it can stand up to all kinds of abuse. You'd want to have a stainless line like this. But this is a street car, and one of the things I learned a long time ago is these lines are super abrasive, and anything that they rub against, they rub off all the paint, they rub off rubber, they rub off plastic, and they wear through things. So they're very, very abrasive, and they're super durable, and it's a wonderful hose to use, but for my application, it's way overkill. This still has a braided core, and this is what's called a nylon braided hose. You can see it's got a metal core in it, so it's got a 350 plus PSI burst strength, and it's intended for oil and fuel. But this line will be far easier on all of the vehicle components that it happens to rub against. So I'm far more interested in using this, and if the line starts to look a little cheesy, that's fine. It's still got a braided line. It's going to be a super tough, strong hose. I still will, work to have a chafe guard on it, but that hose is going to be what I'm going to choose to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and pull one of the lines out after I get it cut to length, and I will videotape how to actually install one of these fittings onto the braided hose, because there's a knack to it, and it's fairly easy to do if you know the steps, and if you don't, it's an exercise in frustration. So I've got a couple of tricks that I use to do this that have worked very well for me over the years, and I'll show everybody else. I used to do this on race cars and other drag race vehicles and road race vehicles that I used to have. So I've got some techniques that I'll use, and I'll explain all of that as I go through and show you how to put this together. Okay, so what I did is I removed the 2 lines that run to the transmission cooler in the front of the car, and what I did is I had them in there, and I marked them for length. So I wrapped the spot where I'm going to be cutting the lines, and then I marked carefully exactly where I wanted the lines cut, and I've got the 2 marks on the 2 different lines. All I need to do now is just disassemble the assemblies to make it easy to cut them separately. I marked them top and bottom so that I know which line goes on the top and which line goes on the bottom, just to give myself a little bit of understanding. But in getting this all apart and getting everything sized up, one of the things I noticed is that the fittings that I ordered, and I ordered, fittings off of Amazon. So I didn't order Earls or Russell fittings. So I ordered the Evil Energy fittings, and this one here on your left, in my right hand, is the Evil Energy fitting, and you can see it's a nice shiny fitting, and it looks nice. And then I ordered a generic fitting, and I ordered this off of Amazon only because I could get it sooner. And one of the challenges that I started noticing is when I went to go assemble these, the Evil Energy fitting has a really nice stiff firm feeling seal inside the swivel, and this one does not. It's got a really loose seal, and there's actually a burr in it, like it's got a little flat spot inside it when you turn it. So it gave me pause, and I started to look a lot closer at the fittings, and I noticed that the fitting here on this brand, this Evil Energy one, is a lot fatter right around the collar of the retaining nut. And this one is very thin, and it's got a very thin line around that retaining nut. Also, when you flip it over and look at the bottom, the edge on this one, the edge that slides down into the tube, seems a lot sharper and more well-defined than this one, which looks a little blunted. So I'm just a little leery about using this one, and I'm sure there's some other differences in the fittings themselves. One of the things I noticed in this one, in this fitting, that's quite a bit different than the Evil Energy one, is when you look inside this fitting, there's nothing in there for helping pull the fitting onto the line. The Evil Energy ones, on the other hand, have a reverse rotation spiral cut into it that you basically thread the hose into to help hold the hose when you assemble the fitting. So I'm going to veto. I ran out of fittings of the Evil Energy. I only have one left, and I'm not going to use the other branded one, the generic or offshore branded one. I just think these give me a lot of pause, and because of how much work it would be to change it, I'd have to disassemble the car. I'm not going to use either of those, and I've ordered another Evil Energy fitting. For my purposes, I think the Evil Energy one's going to be just fine. You know, normally I use Russell or Earl's or one of the other brands, but I just wasn't able to get those in any kind of short order. So I've got this. So what I'm going to do now is now that I got these hoses separated, I'm going to cut this hose at the spot here using a die grinder, and of course a pair of safety glasses, safety first, and make sure that I've got these cut, and I'll come back as I'm cutting it and show you how to square off the end. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use my cutoff wheel here, and I'm just going to go down and keep this edge as perpendicular as I can and cut through the hose. So I'm just going to go ahead and get it going. Okay, so I've cut off the hose, and you can see the hose is fairly square on the end, but it needs just a little bit of trimming because it's a little high right here. So what you do is you look at the direction of the wheel that's spinning, and you want to spin the wheel so it's going into the center of the hose to keep the outside edge from fraying. So I'll just show you how that looks. And then I'm going to go back to the other side, clean that up. Okay, I got one more little bit here. All right, so we've got a nicely cleaned up hose there, and it's all done beautifully. Okay, so the hose is cut. Now let's go and install a fitting. The Evil Energy fittings that I got, at least they're branded. They've got a brand name on them. But they go ahead and they give a pretty good description of how to install the fittings right on the instructions, and they're super easy to install. Probably the easiest fittings I've installed on braided line. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the steps for you. So I just cut off the hose, and we still have the residual tape that held the hose together that I need to remove. So I'm just going to remove this tape from the outer surface of the hose. And once that tape is removed, you be very careful because it's going to pull a little bit of you can see how it frayed the nylon web covering a little bit. And then you take the fitting piece, the hose end itself, and that hose end you're going to grip in the little tool, the vise tool that I had shown earlier. And what we're going to do is we're going to clamp it in there so that's in there really well. Now, because this has a little spiral core inside the fitting, it's super simple to install. You simply insert it, and then you're going to rotate this counterclockwise until you get the hose bottomed out all the way up at the top of the fitting. And I'll keep threading this in. It doesn't take much effort. You have to just keep a little bit of pressure on it, threading it into the fitting. There we go. There we go. Nice and tight. So when we look, if we look inside this fitting, you can see the hose is butted nicely all the way up against it, and I've got none of the braided lines sticking into the fitting area. So that's a good sign. So the next thing that I do, and this is just a precaution that I always do, is I take a little bit of the masking tape. Take a little bit of masking tape, and I tear it off. And what I do is, just as a reference point, I wrap it around to just mark where the fitting butts up against the hose. So you can see there's no gap there. Sometimes when you put these fittings on, as you start to tighten the fitting in, you wind up with, as the fitting gets pressed into here, it starts to push the hose out of the fitting, and that's the last thing you want. So what I've done is I've put this little bit of tape on here just to measure and monitor that I don't have any of the hose push out of the fitting. Okay, so now the next step is we're going to take this fitting and we're gonna lube it up with a little bit of assembly lube. This is engine bearing assembly lube. It's a nice lubricant, and we're gonna just lubricate the fitting itself so that it'll slide into the hose nicely. Put the cap back on this. All right, now we're going to take this fitting and we're going to capture it inside this little fixture and have it nicely on there, and we're going to take this hose now, we're going to push it down onto that fitting, and now we're going to rotate the hose and the fitting the opposite direction. We're turning it clockwise now instead of counterclockwise as we inserted the hose. And the fitting itself is holding the hose in place as it tightens up, and as you tighten it more and more, that fitting is increasing the pressure on the inside of that hose. Now I'm going to use the special pliers that I've got, or the crescent, I guess, the adjustable wrench. And this is my AN wrench, and we're just going to continue to tighten this fitting down. And you don't want to twist the hose. You want to keep the hose as nice and straight as possible. And as we tighten this down, that fitting, you can notice that the hose is not pushing out of the fitting. It's retaining itself nicely inside that fitting. I'm just going to move this up just a bit for some clearance. All right, you tighten it down until the fitting butts up against the fitting. Actually, I think what I'll do is I'm going to tighten this up just a little bit more. There we go. Okay. Now when we undo this, if we look carefully, we can see we didn't lose any distance here, and we now have a fitting nicely tightened up, right up and butted up against this, this nut. And there we have it. I have one of the hoses completely done and ready to install back on the car. So that's one hose done. I have one more fitting to install, and then I can install the lines back onto the vehicle, and I'll come back with a video of everything all installed and go over it. One thing I left out is once you assemble the line, there's all kinds of cutting debris and bits of rubber and other pieces in there. You might want to flush it out. So what I do is I take a little bit of brake clean, and I spray in here. You notice I've got the hose end here kind of held down right here. So I'm going to put a little bit of brake clean in there. It runs through the hose end, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do this and blow through, and it'll blow out the bottom of the cable. There we go. Hose is flushed, cleaned, and now ready to install in the vehicle, and I'll install it a little bit later today. Okay, now that all the hoses are reinstalled, I have a few things that I kind of wanted to bring up. I've got the whole car back together, and I've road tested the car, and there's a few things I wanted to point out about how the vehicle, some final fitment pieces that I needed to do. One, the lower hoses, when they went down through under the frame rail to get back into the chamber where the transmission cooler was going to sit, I had to clearance the side panel by cutting a slot in the side of it to be able to clearance the internal plastic baffle around the two lines that were there. I also put a rubber chafe guard around those hoses where they went through the plastic, and I'll show an image of what that looks like from below. Now that image shows the lines running through, and it was pretty easy to clearance that and to fit that as I put the intercooler back in. So that was the one little clearance piece, and it contained that entire area really well. The other thing is that when I went through and reassembled the car, one of the things when I had the factory airbox back on the car is that I had just had the factory air cleaner sitting down on top of the upper baffle. And I think that at speed, that baffle was lifting up off of the top of the radiator and not allowing all of the air that came in through the bottom of the car to flow through the radiator. So one of the things that I did is I made a piece to extend, and I used a wider, fatter aftermarket radiator. And what I wound up doing is, you can see these two original holes that are on this baffle right here, these two holes. In order to be able to reattach it to the factory fan shroud that's right here, remember this Howe radiator is a lot thicker than the factory radiator. So this distance here, I had to make a little spacer to be able to mount this and then secure it. And these are just a couple of very shallow threading rivets that rivet together, and stainless steel fasteners. And that holds the upper portion of the radiator down really well. And I've got an image of what that little bracket template looks like. And it's a pretty simple measurement little piece that I have. And I'll show a picture of what that bracket looks like in an image right here. Okay, so that was the two things with the clearancing of the holes and then the upper piece. There's one more thing about the fittings. When I put this all together in the road tests, I found out that Teflon tape doesn't do a very good job, even if it's petroleum Teflon tape designed for oils and fuels. To transmission fluid, especially the Dexron fluid, I could not get it to seal. So I took the fittings all apart, the 1/2-inch pipe thread fitting with the press-in GM coupler, and I used JB Weld, and I permanently glued that fitting by JB welding it and then threading it together and letting it dry overnight. And that solved an issue that I had with the fitting leaking, which was very frustrating. So I managed to get the fitting all sealed. I have the radiator shroud working well, and I got the lines underneath all clearanced. So now, finally, I'm able to take the car out and drive it and be able to figure out the final bits of the tune. And I'm hopeful that now that I've got this piece figured out, Mr. Jason Howe will be able to give me a hand again and carry on with the tuning. And I truly appreciate a lot of the input that Jason had. So anybody else out there that's looking for somebody who's extremely competent at being able to not only perform the tuning, but also explain to you what he's doing and why, Jason is excellent at that. So I'm very grateful for his help in doing that. So now I've got the car pretty much done. Oh, and there's one last thing. So when I mounted the transmission cooler on the front of the AC condenser, I mounted it flush with the bottom of the AC condenser. And unfortunately, because it's 13 inches wide and it's 2 inches thick, it entirely blocks the entire area where air comes up from underneath the radiator. The way the shroud is designed from underneath, the air comes up, and I had to clearance one of the plastic shields. So if I were to do this again, or if I would recommend to anybody else, I would mount the transmission cooler at least 2 inches up from the base of the AC condenser to be able to have it clearance well enough so that air can get past the get past the transmission cooler up into the chamber where it's at. Otherwise, it completely blocks 50% of the opening to the front of the AC condenser, and that's not going to be good for airflow. So on mine, I resolved that by just clearancing and trimming out the duct over the intercooler. But for others, if you just mount it 2 inches higher, there's still room to the power steering cooler for you to be able to raise that transmission cooler up. It was a lot of work to get it mounted where it was, and I chose just to leave it because I discovered that right at the very end. So the 4 things: make sure you seal down the top of the radiator shroud to the top of the fan shroud using a little plate. And remember that little plate you can make when they're very easy. You just cut it out of tin or aluminum and make it fit. The second thing is make sure you put the holes and put a chafe guard around the hoses as they go through the holes. The third thing is make sure you seal the threads on the pipe thread for the 6AN fitting into the transmission, the factory transmission type press-in connection. Make sure you use JB Weld on that. And then the last thing is make sure if you mount that transmission cooler, you have it raised up at least 2 inches from the bottom of the AC condenser to allow air to move past it and up in front. So that's all of the things to get it done. Now here's some feedback on the running of the car after I've got it done. Took the car out, ran it through heavy, hard runs. Transmission temperature did get up to 210, but very short driving, 3-4 miles, started bringing the transmission temperatures right back down to 185, 190 degrees, which is right where you want it to be. So so far it's a success. It has now increased the transmission's capability of being able to be cooled by the transmission cooler, no matter how much abuse I put into this through trying to do drag racing starts and stops. So I've got that done. The next video will be a look at probably the tuning and the final running of the car and what kind of times I manage with it, and if I'm very fortunate I can get it on a dyno and actually give you some specific output numbers from the back wheels. If you like this video, please subscribe, like, and share. I really appreciate that. Currently we're sitting at 960 subscribers. I'm very close to that 1,000 number, so I'm hoping to push myself over 1,000 subscribers. Thanks for all of your help in making that happen, everyone. Bye for now.